Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting cold cases: two women, a sunny summer trail, and a crime so baffling that after nearly 2 decades, law enforcement still cannot say with certainty what happened or who is responsible. A mother and her daughter went for a hike. They never came home, and somewhere out there, someone knows why. Here's what happened. It is, by any definition, a perfect hiking day in one of the most beautiful corners of the American Northwest. Mary Cooper was 56 years old on July 11, 2006. By all public accounts, she was the kind of woman who knew how to enjoy that kind of morning. She had a daughter she loved, and that daughter, 27-year-old Susanna Stodden, was with her that day. The two of them had set out to hike the Pinnacle Lake Trail in Snohomish County, Washington. It is a relatively accessible trail, part of the vast Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest system, a trail that draws hikers from the greater Seattle area and beyond, people looking for that combination of natural beauty and manageable exertion that the Pacific Northwest does better than almost anywhere. They started their hike, and then, at some point on that trail, something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. Later that same day, other hikers made a discovery that no one should ever have to make. Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden were found not far from the trailhead. Both women had been shot to death. Who killed Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden, and why? It tells us something about who these women were. They liked each other. They chose each other's company. They were hiking together not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The Pinnacle Lake Trail in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest is located in Snohomish County, Washington. Snohomish County sits just north of King County, which contains Seattle, and the county is a place of extraordinary geographic variety. You move east from the suburban communities near Interstate 5 and Puget Sound, through the foothills, into dense old-growth forest and mountain terrain that feels genuinely remote despite being within a reasonable drive of a major metropolitan area. That proximity to Seattle, to Everett, to the communities of western Snohomish County, is part of what makes the trail system in that region so popular. People can leave work on a Friday, drive an hour or so, and be standing in wilderness that feels genuinely untouched. The Pinnacle Lake Trail is part of that network. It is a trail that draws hikers of varying experience levels. It is not considered an extreme wilderness route. It is the kind of trail that a mother and her adult daughter might choose for a pleasant summer outing, which is, according to public reporting, exactly what Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden did on July 11, 2006. What we know from public sources, including reporting by the Seattle Times, Como News, Kiro 7, and the Herald of Everett, Washington, is that the two women went out to hike that trail on that date, and that they were discovered by other hikers who came upon them on the trail. The women were found a short distance from the trailhead, according to reports. They had been shot. That detail has occupied the minds of investigators and true crime researchers alike for nearly 2 decades, because it raises immediate questions. If this occurred near the trailhead, were there other people nearby? Were there vehicles in the parking area? Could someone have been seen entering or leaving? Could there have been witnesses who didn't know what they had witnessed? These are the kinds of questions that investigators would have asked immediately, and they are questions we will return to as we examine the investigation. When law enforcement arrived at the Pinnacle Lake Trailhead on July 11, 2006, they were responding to a homicide scene in a somewhat unusual jurisdictional context. The trail is located within the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, which is federal land managed by the United States Forest Service. That means that while Snohomish County has jurisdiction over the homicide investigation as a matter of local law enforcement authority, the FBI also has a jurisdictional interest because of the federal land aspect, and the U.S. Forest Service has its own law enforcement arm that would be involved in securing and managing the scene. This multi-agency involvement is documented in public statements and reporting over the years. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office has led the investigation. The FBI's Seattle Field Office has participated. The U.S. Forest Service has been part of the response. According to public records and news reporting, all 3 agencies were involved in the investigation. That kind of multi-agency collaboration can be both an asset and a complication. It brings more resources to bear, more expertise, more manpower. But it also means more coordination is required, more communication between bureaucratic structures, more complexity in managing information and jurisdiction. For a case that would prove to be extraordinarily difficult, those resources would ultimately not be enough to produce an arrest. A robbery gone wrong is, tragically, one of the more comprehensible categories of violent crime in the sense that it fits an understandable if horrifying logic. Someone wants something someone else has, violence occurs, and the nature of that transaction leaves behind a certain kind of evidence pattern. When investigators rule that out, or at least say it does not appear to be the motive, the field of possible explanations both opens and narrows simultaneously. It opens because now you have to consider a wider range of possible reasons someone might commit this act. It narrows because random opportunistic robbery is off the table, which suggests a more targeted or more situationally specific act. If it was not robbery, then what was it? Investigators have stated publicly, including in cold case bulletins released by the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, that the motive remains unclear. Unclear. After nearly 20 years, after FBI involvement, after multiple appeals to the public, the motive remains unclear. Cold cases, by their nature, cycle through periods of intense activity and periods of reduced focus as investigative resources shift and as new information, or the absence of new information, dictates priorities. But the Cooper and Stodden case has not been forgotten. It has been the subject of periodic renewed public appeals. Law enforcement has offered rewards over the years for information leading to an arrest. Rewards are a standard tool in cold case investigation, and they serve a specific purpose. They are designed to reach people who may have information but have not come forward, perhaps because of fear, perhaps because of conflicted loyalties, perhaps because they were not sure their information was relevant, or perhaps because they were present in circumstances they are not eager to disclose. A reward changes the calculus for some of those people. It provides a financial incentive to overcome whatever obstacle was keeping them silent. The fact that rewards have been offered in this case, according to public reporting, tells us something about where investigators believe the key to solving it may lie. They believe someone has information. They believe someone knows something. They may even believe that someone was there. The amount of those rewards and the specific language of the appeals have been documented in public cold case bulletins from the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office and in news reporting from outlets including the Herald of Everett. Anyone with information about this case is encouraged to contact the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office directly, and we will return to that at the end of this video. But it also means more potential people of interest, more vehicles coming and going, more foot traffic that can obscure evidence and complicate the reconstruction of events. Trailheads in the National Forest system typically have parking areas. People pull off highway routes, park, gear up, and head into the trail. They return to their vehicles when they are done. In 2006, there were no routine security cameras at most National Forest trailheads. This is not a shopping mall or a convenience store where every angle is covered by surveillance technology. The trailhead area would have been essentially unmonitored in terms of electronic recording. Any information about who was there that day would have come from the memories and observations of other hikers, from any physical evidence left at or near the scene, and from the careful investigative work of law enforcement. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In an age when we have grown accustomed to the idea that violent crimes are often solved by surveillance footage, by cell phone records, by digital breadcrumbs of various kinds, the Pinnacle Lake Trail in July of 2006 was a setting that offered relatively few of those technological resources. Cell phone coverage in remote forested areas of Snohomish County in 2006 was inconsistent at best. There were no cameras recording the parking lot. The evidence that existed was physical evidence at the scene and whatever witnesses were present. Local investigators are accustomed to working in local jurisdictions, where they know the terrain, know the community, have established relationships with witnesses and informants. On federal land, they are operating in a different context, one where the Land Management Agency, in this case the U.S. Forest Service, has its own law enforcement structure and its own institutional knowledge about who uses the trails, what has been observed over time, what incidents have occurred. The FBI's involvement, through the Seattle Field Office, brought federal investigative resources and expertise to the case. The FBI has specialized units that deal with violent crime, forensic analysis capabilities, and access to national databases that local law enforcement may not have at the same level. The three-agency collaboration was reported publicly and was documented in public statements over the years. But collaboration has its limits. And in a case where the fundamental questions of motive and perpetrator remain unanswered nearly 20 years later, even the combined resources of local sheriffs, the FBI, and the Forest Service have not been sufficient to produce an arrest. That is a remarkable thing. This is not a case that slipped through the cracks in a small jurisdiction with limited resources. Snohomish County is a substantial county. It has a professional sheriff's office. The FBI Seattle field office is a major field office in one of the country's significant metropolitan regions. And yet, no arrest. First, the crime scene itself is vulnerable. Outdoor scenes are exposed to weather. Rain can wash away trace evidence. Wind can disturb physical materials. Animals can interfere with a scene before investigators arrive. Time and the elements conspire against the preservation of forensic evidence in ways that don't apply in the same degree to an indoor crime scene. Second, the witness pool is both harder to identify and harder to reach. Other hikers who were in the area on a given day may have come from any number of communities, driving hours to reach the trailhead. They may not have known anything was wrong when they left. They may not have seen news coverage of the murders for days or weeks, if at all. Identifying and locating every person who was in or near the Pinnacle Lake Trailhead area on July 11, 2006 would have been an enormous investigative undertaking. Third, the setting creates particular challenges for establishing a timeline. Without security footage, without the kind of ambient surveillance that exists in urban environments, investigators are dependent on witness testimony and physical evidence to reconstruct the sequence of events. Who arrived first? Who left when? What the scene looked like at various points during the day. These things must be pieced together from imperfect human memory and physical evidence that may or may not have survived intact. These challenges do not excuse an absence of resolution. They explain, at least in part, why cases like this are so extraordinarily difficult. They are not television crime dramas where a brilliant detective has a breakthrough in the third act. They are the hard, grinding, often heartbreaking work of professional investigators who are doing their best with the evidence they have. Because when an official investigation cannot produce an arrest, the community of people who care about cold cases begins to build its own frameworks, its own hypotheses, its own attempts to make sense of the available information. The case of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden has been discussed in online forums, including Reddit's Unsolved Mysteries, where community members have compiled timelines based on public reporting and have discussed the case in detail. Those discussions, which draw entirely on public information, have generated several recurring theories that are worth examining, not because any of them are established fact, but because they represent the honest attempt of engaged citizens to apply logic to publicly available information. The location of the victims, found a short distance from the trailhead rather than deep in the backcountry, has led some community members to suggest that the encounter may have occurred in a zone where multiple hikers were coming and going, and that whoever was responsible would have appeared, at least superficially, like any other hiker in that environment. This is a theory, not a fact. But it is a theory grounded in the physical geography of the case as reported publicly. And it raises a question that I want you to sit with. If you were hiking on a trail in a national forest and you passed someone, or saw someone at the trailhead parking area, how much would you actually remember about that person a day later? 2 days later? A week later, if that's when you heard about the murders on the news? What details stick? What fades? In July 2006, immediately after the murders were discovered, the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office launched its investigation. The initial reporting in the Seattle Times, the Herald of Everett, and local television news covered the discovery of the bodies, the identification of the victims, the multi-agency response, and the basic facts of the case. Local and regional media gave the story significant attention in the days and weeks following the murders. Over the following years, the case was periodically revisited in news coverage, particularly around anniversaries. The 1-year mark, the 5-year mark, the 10-year mark. These anniversary stories serve an important public purpose. They keep the case in front of the public. They reach people who may not have seen the original coverage. They give law enforcement an opportunity to make renewed appeals for information. The Seattle Times, the Herald, Como News, and Kiro 7 all contributed to this ongoing public record. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office has maintained the case as an active unsolved homicide. Cold case units in sheriff's offices and police departments across the country worked cases that are years or even decades old, reviewing evidence with new technology, re-interviewing witnesses, pursuing leads that develop over time. The availability of improved forensic technology, including advances in DNA analysis, has allowed investigators to revisit physical evidence from old cases and sometimes find new information. Whether that has occurred specifically in this case is not part of the public record available to us. There is no resolution. Most cold cases that persist this long have at least some publicly known component that investigators believe they understand. A named person of interest, even if not charged. A working theory about motive, even if unproven. Some piece of the puzzle that points in a direction. The Cooper-Stodden case, as reflected in the public record, has remained closed in every direction. Investigators have said publicly that no arrests have been made and that the investigation is ongoing, which is both the most accurate and the most frustrating thing that can be said about a case like this. They were a mother and a daughter who chose to spend a summer day together on a mountain trail. They had histories. They had relationships. They had people who loved them and who have spent nearly 20 years without justice, without answers, without the ability to say definitively what happened to the people they lost. The community of family members, friends, neighbors, and advocates who continue to care about this case and to push for resolution are the quiet backbone of cold case investigation. They attend community meetings. They speak to journalists. They reach out to investigators. They post in online forums. They remember. And their persistence matters, because cases are sometimes solved years or decades after the fact precisely because someone who cared kept pushing, kept the name in circulation, kept saying, "This is not over." For anyone watching this video who knew Mary Cooper or Susanna Stodden, we want you to know that we see them as people, not as a mystery to be solved. The mystery exists. We are examining it, but at the center of it are two women who deserve to come home from their hike, and they didn't, and that matters more than anything else we can say today. Trace evidence from the scene, including anything that might have been left by a third party, hair, fibers, fingerprints, can be crucial. In an outdoor setting, as we have discussed, the preservation of trace evidence is more challenging than in an enclosed space, but investigators are trained to collect whatever is available and to analyze it as thoroughly as technology allows. Witness statements from the hikers who discovered the victims and from anyone else who was in the area that day are another critical category. What did they see? When did they arrive? What did the area look like when they got there? Did they see anyone on the trail or in the parking area? Did anything strike them as unusual? Digital evidence, while limited in a 2006 wilderness setting, may still have been relevant. Were either of the victims carrying phones? Were there any digital communications in the days leading up to the hike that might be relevant? These are the kinds of questions investigators would have pursued through standard investigative procedure. None of the specific forensic findings in this case have been disclosed in the public record. Investigators, understandably, do not release detailed forensic findings in active unsolved cases, because that information could be critical to evaluating any future arrest and prosecution. What we know is that the investigation was conducted by professional law enforcement agencies with significant resources. What we do not know is what they found, because that information is properly held in the investigative file. You cannot get to that trailhead without a vehicle, at least not practically for most visitors. You drive to the trailhead, you park, you hike, you return to your vehicle, you drive home. That means that anyone who was at or near that trailhead on July 11, 2006 arrived and departed by road. And roads, even in national forest settings, leave certain kinds of evidence. Tire tracks, if conditions are right. Witness observations of vehicles. License plate numbers, if anyone happened to notice them. The timing of arrivals and departures. In 2006, the kind of automated license plate reading technology that is now more common in law enforcement was not yet widely deployed. There were no traffic cameras on national forest access roads. But law enforcement would have canvassed the area, spoken to other hikers, asked what vehicles they had seen, whether they had noticed anything unusual in the parking area. And investigators would have looked at the physical evidence at and around the trailhead. Whether that canvass produced anything useful is not part of the public record. But it is part of the investigative foundation that would have been laid in the days immediately following the murders. Does it tell us that this was a crime of opportunity with no obvious connection between victim and perpetrator? Does it tell us something about the limitations of forensic evidence in outdoor crime scenes? Or does it suggest something else entirely, something about what has and has not been said publicly? I want you to think about that, and when we get to the end, I want to see your theories in the comments. What do you think has kept this case from being solved? Be thoughtful, be respectful, stick to what the public record tells us and what reasonable inference allows. Over the years, writers, researchers, and advocates have documented incidents of violence in national parks and national forests, arguing that the federal land management system has sometimes under-resourced law enforcement and under-reported crime on public lands. This is a documented public policy discussion that has appeared in publications including national newspapers and congressional testimony. The argument is not that national forests are inherently dangerous places. They are not. Hundreds of millions of people visit national parks and forests every year without incident. The argument is that the jurisdictional complexity of federal land, combined with the remoteness of some locations and the relative scarcity of law enforcement resources per acre, can create conditions in which crimes are harder to prevent, harder to investigate, and harder to solve. That context does not tell us what happened at Pinnacle Lake on July 11, 2006. But it provides a framework for understanding some of the structural challenges that investigators faced, and it is part of the public conversation about this case. The U.S. Forest Service has law enforcement rangers who patrol the national forest system, but the ratio of rangers to acreage is not comparable to the coverage you would find in an urban police district. On any given day, the Pinnacle Lake Trail and the dozens of other trails in that section of the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest may have had no law enforcement presence whatsoever. That is not a failure. It is simply the reality of managing 2 million acres with a limited public safety budget. But it is relevant context for understanding why crimes that occur in these settings are different from crimes that occur in places where police presence is more routine. On Reddit's Unresolved Mysteries, community members have compiled detailed timelines based on public reporting, have discussed the geography of the trail, have analyzed the publicly available investigative statements, and have proposed and debated various theories. These discussions are conducted, at their best, with genuine intellectual seriousness and a commitment to public information rather than unfounded speculation. What strikes those community members, and what strikes me as I examine this case, is the almost complete opacity of the public record when it comes to investigative detail. Most cold cases, over time, accumulate a body of leaked or disclosed investigative information. Sources speak. Documents are released through public records requests. Former investigators write memoirs. Journalists develop relationships with insiders and report on what they learn. In the Baker-Stodden case, the public record has remained unusually thin on investigative detail. The facts we know are essentially the facts that were established in the initial reporting. 2 women, July 11, 2006, Pinnacle Lake Trail, shot to death, no robbery, motive unclear, no arrests, investigation ongoing. There may be very good reasons for that opacity. Active investigations often require information to be held closely, precisely so that it retains its investigative value. If investigators have a working theory, or a piece of evidence they believe could be crucial in a future prosecution, they have strong professional and legal reasons to keep that information out of the public domain. The fact that the public record is thin does not mean the investigative file is thin. It may mean quite the opposite. But from the outside, examining only what is publicly known, the opacity makes this case feel like a locked room with no visible scene. Over the years, rewards have been offered for information leading to an arrest in this case, according to public reporting by the Herald of Everett and other outlets. Rewards in cold cases are typically funded by a combination of governmental bodies and private donors. Law enforcement agencies, Crime Stoppers programs, and victim advocacy organizations all contribute to reward pools in high-profile or emotionally significant unsolved cases. The fact that rewards were offered in the Baker-Stodden case is significant. It tells us that there were people, both in law enforcement and in the community, who believed that someone had information that they had not yet shared. Rewards work in some cases and not in others. When they work, it is typically because there is a specific individual who has been sitting on information, weighing the risks and benefits of coming forward, and the reward tips that balance. When rewards do not produce results, it may mean that the person or people with critical information are not reachable by that kind of incentive. It may mean that whoever is responsible has kept their knowledge entirely to themselves, sharing it with no one who might be tempted to collect a reward. It may mean that the circle of people who know what happened is so small, perhaps a circle of one, that there is simply no one to come forward. None of those possibilities can be confirmed with the public information we have. But they are worth considering as we think about why nearly 20 years of investigative effort has not produced an arrest. When a cold case approaches a significant anniversary, investigators and victim advocates often use that moment to make renewed public appeals. The anniversary provides a newshook that draws media coverage. The media coverage reaches new audiences who may not have heard of the case, or who may have been too young to engage with it when it first happened. The renewed attention can reach people who have moved to different communities, changed jobs, ended or begun relationships, and whose life circumstances have shifted in ways that make them more willing or more able to share information they may have held for years. In the case of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden, anniversary coverage has appeared in regional media, including the Herald of Everett and Seattle area television stations. Law enforcement has used those moments to renew their appeal for information and to remind the public that the case remains unsolved and that investigators continue to work it. The contact information for reporting tips to the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office has been published repeatedly in connection with this case. If you have any information, no matter how small it may seem, you are encouraged to contact the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. Tips can often be submitted anonymously through Crime Stoppers programs, and even a small piece of information that seems insignificant to the person who holds it may be exactly the piece that connects other evidence in a way investigators have been waiting for. To lean into the idea that someone obvious is responsible and that justice is being denied by incompetence or negligence. That is not what we do on this channel, and it is not what honest engagement with this case allows. The investigation into the murders of Mary Cooper and Susanna Stodden has been conducted by professional law enforcement agencies over nearly 20 years. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the U.S. Forest Service are not organizations staffed by the careless or the indifferent. The investigators who have worked this case have done so with the seriousness it deserves. The fact that no arrest has been made is not, in itself, evidence of investigative failure. Some crimes are simply extraordinarily difficult to solve. Some perpetrators are extraordinarily careful. Some crimes occur in circumstances that limit the availability of evidence. Some crimes remain unsolved, not because investigators failed, but because the evidence trail has not yet produced the breakthrough that will crack the case open. That is hard to say and harder to accept when you are talking about two women who deserve justice. But it is honest, and honesty is what we owe to Mary Cooper, to Susanna Stodden, and to you. Distance from population centers creates delays in discovery and reporting, giving evidence more time to degrade and giving perpetrators more time to leave the area. The absence of ambient surveillance, meaning the cameras and electronic records that characterize urban environments, removes entire categories of evidence that investigators in cities often take for granted. The transient nature of the user population, people who drive from distant communities to hike for a day and then return home, makes witness identification and follow-up difficult. And the physical environment itself, with its exposure to weather, wildlife, and foot traffic, makes forensic evidence collection harder. These factors do not make wilderness homicides unsolvable. They are solved. Cases from national parks and national forests have been resolved through patient investigative work, sometimes years or decades after the fact. DNA technology in particular has proven to be a game changer in cold cases, including wilderness cases, because biological evidence that was collected at the time of the crime and preserved can sometimes be reanalyzed with tools that didn't exist when the crime occurred. Whether biological evidence collected at the Pinnacle Lake scene is part of the ongoing investigation is not something the public record can tell us. But it is a legitimate area of hope in cases like this. The science continues to advance. The investigative tools that exist today are meaningfully more powerful than those available in 2006. And investigators who are committed to a case will continue to apply new tools to old evidence for as long as it takes. They exist in communities of people who knew the victims, who remember the news coverage, who drove past that trailhead and felt the weight of what happened there. Snohomish County is a community. Everett, the county seat, is a city of real people with a local newspaper, the Herald, that has covered this case for nearly 20 years. The greater Seattle area, from which many hikers on the Pinnacle Lake Trail would have come, is a community of real people who were shaken by this case in 2006 and who continue to carry it. The true crime community online, including the members of Reddit's Unsolved Mysteries who have spent hours compiling and discussing the public record of this case, is a community of real people who care about justice for Mary and Susanna. That community is not just an audience for a tragedy. It is a resource. It is a network of people who talk to other people, who share information, who remember details and make connections. The true crime community has contributed to the resolution of cold cases before. Not by conducting their own investigations, which is neither appropriate nor effective, but by keeping cases visible, by reaching people who have information, and by creating spaces where public discussion can surface details that were known but not shared. If you are watching this video and you remember something from July 11, 2006, something you saw on the Pinnacle Lake Trail or at the trailhead, something you heard in the days or weeks after the murders, something that has sat in the back of your mind for nearly 20 years, please consider contacting the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. You can submit tips anonymously through Washington State Crime Stoppers programs. What feels like a small detail to you may be exactly what investigators need. On July 11, 2006, Mary Cooper, 56 years old, and her daughter Susanna Stodden, 27 years old, drove to the Pinnacle Lake Trail in Snohomish County, Washington, located within the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. It was a beautiful summer day. They intended to hike. At some point during their outing, both women were shot and killed. Their bodies were discovered by other hikers a short distance from the trailhead. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office responded, along with the FBI and the U.S. Forest Service, given the location on federal land. Investigators determined publicly that robbery did not appear to be the motive. The motive has been officially described as unclear. No suspects have been named. No arrests have been made. Rewards have been offered. Anniversary appeals have been made. The investigation has been maintained as active. That is what the public record tells us. And at its heart, it is a story of two women and an unanswered question that has lasted nearly 20 years. That type of motive typically leaves a detectable trail in the victims' lives, in their communications, their relationships, their histories, something that investigators can follow backward from the crime to the perpetrator. The fact that no arrest has resulted after 20 years does not confirm or deny this possibility, but it does suggest that if interpersonal conflict was involved, either the connection was not visible in the available evidence, or the evidence has not yet been sufficient to support a prosecution. Circumstantial opportunism would suggest an encounter on the trail that escalated, without any prior connection between perpetrator and victims. This type of crime is particularly difficult to investigate precisely because there is no prior relationship to trace. The perpetrator existed in the victim's world only at that one moment, on that trail, on that day. Without forensic evidence or witness testimony connecting a specific individual to the scene, this type of crime can remain unsolved almost indefinitely. The public record does not tell us which of these categories investigators favor. But both possibilities are real, and both carry implications for how the investigation has proceeded and how it might ultimately be resolved. If you had been on that trail that day, or in that parking area, and you had seen something that didn't quite fit, something that seemed slightly off, that you filed away in your memory as probably nothing, a vehicle leaving quickly, a person who seemed out of place, something you heard, something you noticed and then moved on from because it didn't seem important in the moment, and then you went home and eventually you heard on the news what had happened, would you have come forward? Would you have called law enforcement and said, "I don't know if this is relevant, but I was there and I noticed this"? Most of us would like to think the answer is yes. But the research on witness behavior tells us that people often hesitate. They are not sure their information is relevant. They don't want to be wrong. They don't. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.